The wilderness of Alaska does not forget. It holds its secrets the way permafrost holds the bones of ancient creatures, suspended, preserved, waiting for the precise moment when the thaw comes and everything buried finally rises to the surface. On a gray Tuesday morning in October of 1994, in the small fishing and mining community of Talkeetna, Alaska, a town of fewer than 400 permanent residents nestled at the confluence of three rivers, beneath the shadow of Denali's massive white shoulder, a young woman named Carrie Anne Merrish walked out of her modest split-level home on Birch Creek Road, stepped into the cold morning air that smelled of wood smoke and river ice, and was never seen alive again. She was 27 years old. She had a daughter who had just turned 4. She had a cup of coffee sitting on the kitchen counter, still warm, still waiting. And for nearly 3 decades, the question that haunted the people who loved her, the investigators who worked the case, and the community that mourned her remained the same, unanswered question that seemed to echo across every frozen lake and every dark spruce forest in that corner of the world. Who took Carrie Anne Merrish, and why did it take so long for anyone to answer for it? To understand what happened to Carrie Anne Merrish, you first have to understand Talkeetna itself, because in Alaska, geography is not merely backdrop. Geography is character. Geography is fate. Talkeetna sits approximately 115 miles north of Anchorage, accessible in 1994 primarily by a single paved road that wound through boreal forest so dense and so uniform that strangers had been known to become disoriented simply pulling off to the side of the road. The Susitna River, wide and gray-green and utterly indifferent to human concern, curved around the western edge of town like a slow arm. The Talkeetna River joined it from the northeast. And the Chulitna came down from the mountains to the north, cold and clear and fast, its current strong enough to pull a grown person under without warning. 3 rivers meeting in one place, a confluence that the Denali Athabascan people had known for thousands of years as a place of power and provision. In 1994, it was a place of about 412 people, give or take the seasonal population of mountain climbers and guides who used Talkeetna as a base camp for Denali expeditions. The permanent residents of Talkeetna were a particular kind of Alaskan. Some had come north in the 1970s during the pipeline boom, made enough money to buy land, and simply never left. Others had been born there, the children and grandchildren of homesteaders and trappers and gold miners who had understood instinctively that the last American frontier demanded a certain tolerance for isolation and silence. The socio-economic fabric of the town was rough-edged, practical, and deeply communal in the way that only small, remote communities can be. People knew each other's dogs by name. They knew who was struggling through a bad winter, who had run short on heating oil, who had taken a job at the lodge and who had been let go from the cannery downriver. Privacy was respected, but true secrets were nearly impossible to keep, or so everyone believed. Carrie Anne Merrish, born Carrie Anne Holbrook, in Wasilla, Alaska, in the spring of 1967, had moved to Talkeetna in 1989 after meeting her husband, Dale Merrish, at a fish processing plant near Dillingham where both had taken summer work. Dale was 31 at the time of their first meeting, lean and dark-haired, with the kind of self-assured quiet that some women found magnetic and others found unsettling. He had grown up partly in Fairbanks, partly in Oregon, and had arrived in Alaska with a background in small engine repair and a reputation among his coworkers as someone who kept to himself, but could always be counted on to get the work done. He and Carrie Anne were married in the fall of 1990 in a small ceremony attended by her mother, her younger sister Paulette, and a handful of friends from the processing plant. By 1994, they had been in Talkeetna for 5 years. Dale ran a small engine repair shop out of a converted workshop behind their home. Snowmobiles, ATVs, boat motors, generators, the kinds of machinery that Alaskan life depended upon absolutely. Carrie Anne worked 3 days a week at the Talkeetna General Store, a combined grocery, hardware and postal outlet that functioned as the informal town center, and she spent her remaining days raising their daughter, Lily, who had turned 4 in September of 1994. Lily was a small, serious-faced child with her mother's dark eyes and her father's reserved demeanor, and she was known in town as a child who listened more than she spoke and watched everything with a careful, measuring attention. The morning of Tuesday, October 11, 1994, began like any other October morning in the Mat-Su Valley. The temperature at dawn was 22 degrees Fahrenheit. There had been a light snow the night before, perhaps 2 inches, and it lay undisturbed on the woodpile beside the house, on the roof of the workshop, on the seat of the rusted swing that hung from the single birch tree in the side yard. The sky was the particular shade of pewter gray that Alaskan residents know means more snow is coming, probably by afternoon. Wood smoke rose from perhaps a dozen chimneys on Birch Creek Road and the surrounding streets. Somewhere across the neighborhood, a dog was barking, the deep, persistent bark of a sled dog marking territory. Carrie Anne had Tuesdays off from the general store. Her routine on Tuesdays was consistent enough that several neighbors could later describe it in detail. She woke early. Her mother-in-law, Barbara Merrish, who lived in a smaller cabin on the same property, would later tell investigators that she had heard Carrie Anne's kitchen light come on at approximately 6:15 that morning, visible from the cabin window. Carrie Anne made coffee. She made oatmeal for Lily. She walked Lily to the end of the driveway to meet the van that took children into town for the morning preschool program at the community center, a detail that matters, because that van arrived at 7:45 and Lily was on it. Lily was wearing her red wool coat with the wooden buttons. She was carrying a small backpack shaped like a bear. The preschool program ended at noon. Lily Merrish was never picked up. At 12:15, the program coordinator, a woman named Ruth Haynes, called the Merrish residence. There was no answer. She called again at 12:30. Again, no answer. At 12:45, because this was Talkeetna and because everyone knew everyone, Ruth Haynes called Barbara Merrish's cabin directly. Barbara answered, expressed immediate concern, and walked to the main house to check. The back door, which faced the workshop, was unlocked. The coffee cup, ceramic, blue, with a small chip on the handle, was on the kitchen counter. The oatmeal pot had been washed and left on the drying rack. Carrie Anne's winter coat was hanging on its hook by the door. Her winter coat was hanging on its hook by the door. Outside, the temperature was now 17 degrees and dropping, and there was a thin new layer of snow beginning to fall. Barbara Merrish called the Alaska State Troopers at 1:03 in the afternoon. The first trooper arrived at the property at 1:57. The workshop was locked from the outside with a padlock, and Dale Merrish was not on the property. His truck, a 1988 Ford F-150, dark green, was also gone. Barbara told the trooper that Dale had left for Anchorage that morning before 6 to pick up parts for a snowmobile repair job, something he did periodically and had mentioned the evening before. The trooper, a young man named Officer Dennis Prake, noted in his initial report that there were no signs of a struggle inside the home. The back door showed no evidence of forced entry. Carrie Anne's purse, brown leather, worn at the corners, was on the small table near the front door, containing her wallet, her state identification card, and $32 in cash. Her truck, a gray 1991 Chevy Silverado, was in the driveway, exactly where it always was. The swing in the side yard hung still. The small toy truck that Lily had left in the yard the afternoon before lay on its side in the new snow, one wheel turning slowly in the wind. Officer Prake noted one additional detail that he described in his report as possibly significant. In the snow beside the back steps, the steps that led from the kitchen door toward the workshop, there was a single set of boot prints. They led away from the house in the direction of the tree line at the back of the property, approximately 200 yards away. The prints had been partially filled by the new snowfall, which meant they were at least 2 to 3 hours old. The prints did not return. By the following morning, word of Carrie Anne Merrish's disappearance had moved through Talkeetna the way news always moved in a town that size, fast, thorough, and personal. By 8 in the morning on October 12th, more than 60 volunteers had assembled at the community center parking lot, stamping their boots against the cold, carrying thermoses of coffee and handmade signs, prepared to search. The Alaska State Troopers had deployed a team of 8 officers. Search and rescue volunteers from Palmer and Wasilla were en route, bringing tracking dogs. The search focused initially on the tree line behind the Merrish property and the network of trails that extended from it. ATV trails, snowmobile trails, hunting paths that wound for miles through the spruce and birch forest toward the Talkeetna River's eastern tributary. The dogs worked the boot prints from the back steps and followed a scent trail approximately 400 yards into the trees before losing it near a frozen creek crossing where the ice had been disturbed. Someone or something had broken through the thin surface ice, but the creek was shallow, and the current, even in October, was persistent enough that it would have carried most trace evidence downstream toward the Susitna within hours. Dale Merrish returned from Anchorage at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon on October 12th, roughly 31 hours after Carrie Anne was last confirmed alive by Barbara Merrish. He was met at the driveway by 2 Alaska State Troopers and a detective from the Matsu Borough Investigations Unit, a woman named Senior Investigator Margaret Kloss, who would become the primary investigator on the case and who would work it in various capacities for the next 28 years. Those who were present at that first meeting, Investigator Kloss, the 2 troopers, and Barbara Merrish, would later describe Dale's reaction in notably similar terms. He was calm, unnervingly calm. He asked what had happened in a tone that Kloss later described in her notes as measured, controlled, without the reactive quality you expect from a spouse confronting news of a missing partner. He did not rush toward the house. He did not raise his voice. He answered the initial questions about his whereabouts in Anchorage clearly and without hesitation, providing the name of the parts supplier, the approximate time of his arrival, and the approximate time he had departed. He said he had stayed overnight at a motel on the Glen Highway because it had gotten late and the road conditions were poor. He provided the name of the motel. Investigators verified the motel registration within 48 hours. Dale Merrish had checked in at 7:42 in the evening on October 11th and checked out at 9:15 the following morning. The motel was approximately 110 miles from Talkeetna. His truck's odometer, which investigators documented with his consent, showed a mileage consistent with the round trip to Anchorage and back, with approximately 37 additional miles that Dale attributed to a detour through Wasilla to visit a friend, a detail he offered without being asked. Deputies whispered quietly, among themselves and then less quietly, about the 37 miles, about the calm, about the fact that when Investigator Kloss asked Dale if he had any idea where Carrie Anne might have gone, he had paused for a long moment before answering, a pause that Kloss estimated at nearly 8 seconds, long enough that she noted its exact duration in her field book, and then said, "She had friends in the valley. She might have gone to see someone." Not "I'm terrified," not "we have to find her," Not, what do we do, simply, she had friends in the valley. The friend theory was investigated and discarded within a week. Carrie Anne's closest friends, her former co-worker Linda Barr in Wasilla, her sister Paulette in Anchorage, a woman named Terry Vance who lived on the other side of Talkeetna, all confirmed they had not heard from her. Paulette Holbrook Carr, Carrie Anne's younger sister, drove to Talkeetna within 24 hours of being notified and remained there for 3 weeks, organizing her own parallel search efforts. She later told investigators, and subsequently told journalists, that from the first conversation she had with Dale after the disappearance, something felt wrong to her in a way she struggled to articulate. "He asked me," Paulette said in a statement recorded in 1994, "whether Carrie had said anything to me about wanting to leave. Those were his words, wanting to leave. Not running away, not being taken, not something happening to her. Just wanting to leave, like she had made a choice." The physical evidence search yielded several items of note. In the workshop behind the house, investigators found a section of the cement floor that had been recently cleaned. Not unusual for a working repair shop, but notable because the rest of the floor bore the accumulated oil and grime of years of use, while one roughly 4-foot by 6-foot section along the western wall was markedly cleaner. A luminol test, conducted on October 16th by state forensic specialists, produced a faint positive reaction in that section, faint enough that the results were noted as inconclusive and were challenged by the defense in subsequent proceedings. A tire iron found hanging on the workshop wall bore trace amounts of organic material that forensic examiners noted, but were unable to conclusively characterize with the technology available in 1994. That tire iron was logged, cataloged, and placed in evidence storage. Carrie Anne's body was never found. In the absence of a body, in the presence of a husband with a verified alibi, and with forensic results that were suggestive but not conclusive, the investigation did what cold case investigators know with terrible familiarity. It slowed. By December of 1994, the daily search parties had ended. By February of 1995, investigator Kloss was managing 9 other active cases. By the spring of 1995, the Merrish file was categorized as an open, unsolved missing persons case, reviewed periodically but without new leads. Lily Merrish continued to go to preschool. Dale continued to run his repair shop. Barbara Merrish continued to live in the small cabin on the property. And in the evenings, when Lily was in bed, Dale Merrish sat in the living room of the house on Birch Creek Road with the television on and the lights low, and whatever he knew, he kept to himself. For those who have ever sat across from someone and felt in the marrow of their bones that what was being said and what was true were 2 entirely different things, they will understand what investigator Margaret Kloss felt every time she drove past the Merrish property in the years that followed. She said it herself in a later interview. "I knew. I didn't have what I needed, but I knew." Time in Alaska passes differently than it does elsewhere. The winters are long enough to reshape the interior of a person. By 1997, 3 years after Carrie Anne Merrish vanished, the town of Talkeetna had moved on in the way that small towns must move on or else be consumed by their own grief. New families had arrived. Old ones had departed. The general store where Carrie Anne had worked 3 days a week had changed ownership. The community center had been renovated. The preschool program where Lily had been left uncollected on that October noon had been expanded, and none of the current children enrolled in it had any memory of a woman in a blue ceramic coffee cup and a missing coat. Dale Merrish remained in Talkeetna until the spring of 1998. Then he sold the property on Birch Creek Road, the house, the workshop, the cabin, to a family from the Kenai Peninsula, packed his tools and his daughter and what belongings he chose to keep, and relocated to a small town outside of Fairbanks. He left no formal forwarding address with the community. He did not tell Barbara, his own mother, that he was going until approximately 1 week before he left. Barbara Merrish chose to remain in Talkeetna, in a rented room above the hardware section of the general store, and it was Barbara who continued to answer Investigator Klaus's periodic check-in calls throughout the late 1990s and into the 2000s, calls that were professionally routine, but also, both women understood implicitly, something more than routine. Barbara Merrish was a complicated figure in this story, as complicated figures always are. She had never been close to her daughter-in-law. Their personalities were too different, their silences too differently shaped. But she had loved Lily with the unambiguous love that grandmothers sometimes reserve for grandchildren, a love that perhaps compensated for the ambivalence she felt toward her own son. In 1999, she told Investigator Klaus something that she had been turning over in her mind for 5 years. She said that on the morning of October 11, 1994, the morning Carrie Anne disappeared, she had looked out her cabin window at approximately 5:15 in the morning and seen Dale's truck still in the driveway. She had assumed at the time that she was simply mistaken about the time, or that Dale had not yet left. She had never mentioned it to investigators in 1994 because she told herself it didn't mean anything. But 5 years of sitting with it had made her less certain that it didn't mean anything. Clears throat. If Dale's truck was still in the driveway at 5:15, and if he had arrived at the Anchorage motel at 7:42, then the timeline of his departure was tighter than he had described. Possible, perhaps, for a driver who pushed the speed limit on clear roads, but tight enough that it narrowed the window during which he was unaccountably absent from Talkeetna to a period that included the early morning hours, when Carrie Ann's boot prints had been made in the snow beside the back steps. Investigator Klaus noted Barbara's recollection in an addendum to the case file. It was not enough, on its own, to reopen active investigation. Lily Merrish was growing up in the shadow of something she could not name and was not equipped to name, because children carry what adults give them, and what Dale Merrish gave his daughter was silence, and the particular variety of silence that has a weight and a texture and a temperature. Those who knew her during her school years in Fairbanks, teachers, the mother of a close friend, a school counselor named Darlene Ausch who worked with Lily intermittently between the ages of 10 and 14, described a child of unusual interior intensity. She was academically capable. She kept few close friends. She had a recurring nightmare throughout her early teens that she described to Darlene Ausch in careful, controlled language. She was standing at the end of a driveway in the snow, watching someone walk away from her toward the trees, and she could never see the person's face. She was not a child who cried easily, Darlene Ausch said, years later, but she held things. She held things in a way that made me worry for her. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have lived inside the particular domestic architecture of suspicion and intimacy at the same time, they will understand that what Lily Merrish experienced throughout her childhood was not merely grief for a mother she barely remembered. It was something more corrosive. It was the slow accumulation of small things that didn't fit. A father who became rigid and cold when Carrie Anne was mentioned. A grandmother who flinched at certain questions. A box in the back of a closet that Dale moved every time they relocated, and they relocated 3 times between 1998 and 2008, that Lily was told explicitly, on each occasion, never to open. By the time Lily Merrish was 15, she had developed the habit of writing things down, not in a diary exactly, but in a series of small spiral notebooks where she recorded fragments, impressions, memories she wasn't sure were real and others she was certain of but couldn't explain. The blue coffee cup, the red coat with the wooden buttons, The word her father used when she asked where her mother was. Gone, not dead, not lost, gone. As if Carrie Anne Merrish had been a season, or a phase, or a decision that simply hadn't worked out. Dale Merrish's personal life after 1994 followed a pattern that investigators, in retrospect, would characterize as a man keeping himself insulated. He had relationships, two significant ones documented between 1999 and 2010, both of which ended with the woman leaving under circumstances that neither woman elaborated on publicly, but that both, when subsequently contacted by investigators in 2021, described in language that was strikingly similar. One said he was controlling in ways that crept up slowly. The other said he had a quality she could only describe as a locked room that was always there. Neither woman had been physically harmed by Dale Merrish, to their knowledge. Both had left, they said, because of a feeling they couldn't entirely articulate but that they trusted completely. The marriage, if cohabitation without formal ceremony could be called that, with his second long-term partner ended in 2010. By 2012, Dale Merrish was living alone in a rural property outside of Delta Junction, Alaska, still doing engine repair, still quiet, still unremarkable to his neighbors in every visible respect. He was 54 years old. He had a grown daughter he rarely spoke to. He had a mother he never called. He had a case file, 300 miles away in the Matsu Borough Investigative Archives, that bore his name in the margin of every significant notation, and a retired investigator named Margaret Kloss, who had never closed the door on what she knew in her bones. The case broke open on a morning in March of 2021, the way cold cases often break open, not with a dramatic revelation from forensic science, not with a deathbed confession, but with a child, now grown, deciding that the weight of what she had carried long enough belonged somewhere other than inside her own chest. Lily Merrish was 30 years old. She lived in Anchorage, where she worked as a social services coordinator for a nonprofit that assisted families in crisis. A vocational choice that, to those who knew her history, carried a weight of significance that Lily herself rarely spoke about directly. She was unmarried, lived alone with a dog named after a river, and had been in regular contact with a therapist since the age of 22. It was her therapist who, in the fall of 2020, gently encouraged Lily to contact law enforcement, not for the first time, but with a new specificity. Because in the summer of 2020, during a visit to her grandmother Barbara in Talkeetna, Barbara was now 81, still living in the same rented room above the hardware store, still sharp, still carrying her own freight of accumulated certainty. Lily had finally opened the box. The box that had moved with them through 3 states and 4 addresses. The box her father had told her never to open. It contained, among other items, a woman's ring, gold with a small turquoise stone that Lily recognized from photographs as belonging to her mother. A piece of cloth flannel dark green that had been folded with a precision that seemed deliberate, almost ceremonial. A single photograph, the image facing inward, tucked beneath the cloth, and a handwritten note in her father's handwriting that contained only 6 words. She knew. I could not wait. Lily Merrish photographed every item in the box with her phone before replacing everything exactly as she had found it. She did not confront her father. She went home. She sat with what she had found for 6 months, writing in her spiral notebook, and then she called the Alaska Department of Public Safety's Cold Case Unit. The call was received on March 4, 2021. The Cold Case Unit contacted the Matsu Borough Investigative Division the same day. And by March 8th, a detective named Investigator Ramon Solis, who had been assigned to the Merrish cold case as part of a systematic review of unsolved cases from the 1990s, was sitting at his desk at 6 in the morning, reading the full case file that Margaret Kloss had maintained with the obsessive completeness of someone who had never believed a case was truly cold, and making his first call to a retired woman in Palmer, Alaska, who answered on the second ring. "I've been waiting," Margaret Kloss said, when Solis identified himself. There was no surprise in her voice, only the particular steadiness of someone who has believed something for 27 years and finally finds the ground beneath that belief becoming solid. The reinvestigation moved quickly by cold case standards. Within 2 weeks, forensic specialists returned to the evidence logs from 1994. The tire iron, still in storage, still sealed in its evidence bag, was submitted to a modern forensic laboratory in Anchorage using DNA extraction techniques that had not existed in 1994. On April 17, 2021, the laboratory returned results confirming the presence of human biological material on the head of the tire iron, degraded but sufficient for partial profile construction. The partial profile was consistent, at a statistical confidence level that the forensic report described as exceeding 99.6% probability. With the DNA of Carrie Anne Merrish, established from a biological sample provided by her sister Paulette, who had been waiting 27 years for someone to call her with a result. The note from the box, she knew, "I could not wait," was subjected to handwriting analysis. 3 independent examiners confirmed authorship consistent with Dale Merrish's known handwriting from documents signed during the 1994 investigation. The ring, the turquoise ring that Lily recognized from photographs, was confirmed by dental records and goldsmith's marks as a piece purchased in Wasilla in 1991, consistent with a birthday gift that Carrie Ann's mother had given her that year. The piece of flannel cloth, green and folded, was identified by Paulette Hallbrook-Carr as material consistent with a shirt Carrie Anne owned and frequently wore. Paulette's voice, when investigator Solis read her the description over the phone, went quiet in a way that he noted in his report. She said, "That was her camping shirt. She wore it every fall. She loved that shirt." On the morning of June 3, 2021, a Thursday, cool and bright, the kind of Alaska morning that makes people understand why people stay, 4 Alaska State Troopers and investigator Ramon Solis drove to the rural property outside Delta Junction where Dale Merrish lived. They arrived at 7:22 in the morning. Dale was in the workshop behind the house, working on a generator, when the vehicles pulled into the driveway. He saw them coming through the workshop window. Several of the troopers noted this in their subsequent statements, that he had time to observe their approach and to compose himself, or to choose his response, before they reached the door. By the time investigator Solis knocked on the workshop doorframe and identified himself, Dale Merrish was standing with his hands at his sides, looking at the floor, in the manner of a man who has rehearsed this moment in some corner of his mind for a very long time. Investigator Solis said, "Dale Merrish, we have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the disappearance and death of Carrie Anne Merrish." Dale Merrish said nothing. He was handcuffed without incident. He did not resist. He did not ask questions. He did not say his daughter's name. He did not cry. He walked to the trooper vehicle with the same measured calm that Margaret Kloss had observed at the end of a driveway in Talkeetna 27 years earlier, and he sat in the back of the vehicle with his hands in his lap and his eyes forward, and the workshop door swung slowly in the morning wind behind him. The generator he had been working on sat half disassembled on the workbench, its parts laid out in precise order, waiting for hands that would not return. Clear's throat. The news of Dale Merrish's arrest moved through Alaska in the particular way that arrests in cold cases move, first through the law enforcement community, then through the local media, then through the national outlets that cover the intersection of crime and time, where the passage of decades gives every detail the quality of a story that was always waiting to be told. By the evening of June 3rd, Talkeetna itself was the subject of calls from journalists in Anchorage and Fairbanks. By June 4th, the story had reached Seattle and Portland. By June 5th, it had been picked up by the wire services. In Talkeetna, the reaction was layered and complicated and deeply human. Some residents who had known Dale Merrish during the years he lived there expressed shock, genuine, full-bodied shock, the kind that restructures memory retroactively, causing people to revisit old conversations and old impressions in a new and terrible light. Others said they were not shocked at all, that they had always felt something was wrong, that the town had known on some wordless, atmospheric level and had simply not known what to do with knowing. A woman who had been a neighbor on Birch Creek Road and was now in her mid-70s said to a journalist, simply, "We should have done more. We all should have done more." Paulette Holbrook Carr, Carrie Anne's sister, was reached by a reporter at her home in Anchorage on the afternoon of June 3rd. She had already been informed directly by investigator Solis, as was proper, before the arrest was made public. She said, "I need you to understand that we never stopped. Our family never stopped. My mother went to her grave without knowing, and that is the thing I cannot forgive. But Lily did what none of the rest of us could do. She got to the truth. That girl found her mother's truth." Barbara Merrish, Dale's mother, was 82 years old and still living in Talkeetna. When investigator Solis drove to see her in person before the arrest to inform her of what was happening, she sat very still in her chair for a long time after he finished speaking. Then she said, "I always knew what I saw that morning. I always knew his truck was still there at 5:15. I should have said it louder. I should have kept saying it." Solis told her that she had said it in 1999, that it had been recorded, that it had mattered. "Not enough," she said, "not soon enough." The trial of Dale Raymond Merrish began on February 7, 2022, in the Superior Court of Alaska, 3rd Judicial District, in Anchorage. He was charged with first-degree murder in the death of Carrie Anne Merrish, whose body had never been recovered but whose death was established through the physical evidence, the forensic findings, and the testimony of witnesses who collectively constructed a portrait of 27 years of concealment. He entered a plea of not guilty. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Joanne Fell, presented the case methodically over 18 days. The tire iron and its DNA analysis, the note and its handwriting confirmation, the ring and the flannel shirt material, Barbara Merrish's testimony about the truck in the driveway, the odometer reading and its 37 unexplained miles, the cleaned section of workshop floor and the faint luminol result from 1994, now reassessed in the context of the accumulated physical evidence. The testimony of Lily Merrish, who sat in the witness chair in a courtroom in Anchorage and described finding the box and everything in it in a voice so precise and so steady, and so completely controlled that the courtroom was utterly silent for the entire duration of her testimony, and remained silent for several seconds after she finished, as if the room itself needed a moment before resuming normal function. The defense argued that the DNA evidence was degraded and the statistical confidence overstated, that the handwriting on the note was not definitively established, that the presence of a turquoise ring in a box did not constitute evidence of a crime, that Dale Merrish's calm demeanor was the temperament of a private man under stress, not the behavior of someone concealing guilt. Those who had followed the case, and by now thousands were following it from Alaska and well beyond, observed that the defense's arguments were not unreasonable in isolation. Individually, Each piece of evidence had gaps. The power of what the prosecution had assembled was not in any single item, but in the accumulated weight of everything together. The tire iron and the ring and the note and the timeline and the 37 miles and the cleaned floor and a grandmother's memory of a truck in a driveway at 5:15 in the morning, and a daughter's spiral notebooks full of the things she had spent 30 years trying to name. On March 4th, 2022, exactly 1 year to the day after Lily Merrish had made her call to the cold case unit, the jury returned after 11 hours of deliberation with a verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Carrie Anne Merrish. Dale Raymond Merrish showed no visible reaction when the verdict was read. He sat with his hands on the table before him and his eyes forward, and his face arranged in the same flat, controlled composure that had defined his public presentation for 27 years. His defense attorney placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. Dale Merrish did not acknowledge it. In the gallery, Paulette Halbrookar bent forward in her seat and pressed her hands over her face. Her husband put his arm around her. From behind her hands, she made a sound that those seated nearby described as grief and relief in equal measure. A sound that has no clean name in the language because it belongs to a category of human experience that most people will never understand, and that those who do understand will never forget. Lily Merrish sat 3 seats away. She did not cry, those near her said later. She sat very straight with her hands folded in her lap, and she looked at the judge, and then she looked at her father, and then she looked back at the judge, and then she closed her eyes for a moment that lasted perhaps 5 seconds. When she opened them again, her expression had changed in some way that observers struggled to describe. It was not relief exactly. It was not satisfaction. It was more like the particular quietness that follows the long-delayed resolution of attention that has defined the entire architecture of a life. The sense of finally knowing where the ground is. Clears throat. Dale Merrish was sentenced on April 29, 2022 to 32 years in prison without the possibility of early release. He was 65 years old at sentencing. He offered no statement to the court. He was led from the courtroom by a corrections officer, and the door closed behind him, and that, for those watching from the gallery and from the courtroom steps and from across Alaska, was the last image. A door closing, and on the other side of it, finally, something resembling justice. Music fades in very softly, the same low strings as the opening, but now with something slightly warmer beneath them. What does a case like this mean in the end? When we step back from the dates and the forensic reports and the courtroom transcripts, what are we really looking at? We are looking at a woman named Carrie Anne Merrish who woke up on an October morning in Alaska, made coffee for herself and oatmeal for her small daughter, sent that daughter to school in a red coat with wooden buttons, and was taken from the world before noon. We are looking at the 32 years it took for that wrong to be named as wrong in a court of law. We are looking at a daughter who carried her mother's absence in her body since the age of 4, who grew up sorting fragments of memory and silence and a box she wasn't allowed to open, who became a woman who helps families in crisis, who finally, in her own time and in her own way, did what no investigator, no forensic technology, no community effort had been able to do. She told the truth out loud, in a room full of people, with her eyes open. We are looking at a grandmother who said what she had seen, quietly in 1999, to someone who heard it but could not yet use it, and who was still alive at 82 to hear the verdict read. We are looking at an investigator named Margaret Kloss who never stopped believing, never closed the door entirely, and who sat in a courtroom in Anchorage in March of 2022 to watch a verdict arrive that had been, in her mind and her case file, 27 years in the process of becoming. Carrie Anne Merrish was 27 years old when she was taken. She loved her daughter. She wore a green flannel camping shirt every fall. She drank her coffee from a blue ceramic cup with a small chip on the handle. She left no farewell. She had no choice in how the story of her life was interrupted. But the story of what happened to her and who was responsible and how it was ultimately answered, that story found its way to the light. Sometimes they do, not always, but sometimes. Her name was Carrie Anne Merrish. She deserved to be remembered. She deserved to be heard. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.